Committee, before we get started, I'm going to ask Vice Chair Alan Baker to open us in a prayer, please.
If you allow me to lead us in prayer. Heavenly Father, we are just very grateful just for this opportunity once again to begin another session, and that we just pray that you just grant us the judgment, the wisdom, the discernment as we take up multiple issues. We ask as well that as we take up these different issues, that we may have some multiple opinions and may have disagreements at the time, but that we just ask that you help us to be respectful one of another. We just ask you to continue to guide and direct us in all that we do. We ask your blessings upon us. We ask now that you also guide and direct in Chairwoman Collins as she leads us through this session. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you very much, and I ask Adam to call our roll.
Representative Collins.
Here.
Representative Baker.
Here.
Representative Drummond. Here. Representative Daniels. Representative DeBose. Representative Estes. Here. Representative Fincher. Here. Representative Gidley. Here. Representative Gray. Representative Morris. Representative Paramore. Representative Pascal. Representative Ross. Representative Smith. Representative Woods. A quorum is present.
Thank you very much. I do want to welcome everybody that's on the committee and those in the audience. And we want to say a special welcome to our newest member, Gina Ross. She's got a broad education background, and she is going to be very, very good asset for our committee. So welcome, Gina. Thank you. I have, and several of our committee are on both Education Policy Committee and Education Ways and Means. And those on Ways and Means have been a part of the commission with the Senate Ways and Means to study our funding formula. And I decided that our Education Policy Committee should know what that conversation has been like and what we have discussed and where we've been. And A+ has been a part of that discussion and that information. And so I've asked Mark and Corinne and whoever he asked to come, and he's going to walk us through a good bit of information, but trying to catch you up on what we've done over the since last summer, really together, so that y'all are as informed as everyone else. So please welcome Mark Dixon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. It's been an honor to work with both budget committees over the last few months as they have studied the possibility of modernizing our school funding formula. Just a little bit of context to get us started. The beginnings of these conversations really happened after Tennessee became one of the newest states to adopt a student-weighted funding formula. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today and what that looks like. And Mississippi followed shortly thereafter in 2024. And so those conversations have led us all to really consider what this looks like or could look like in Alabama. And so we've been very grateful to the budget chairman for looking into this and members of the commission for spending a lot of time and a lot of slides and a lot of numbers as they've considered what this might look like for our state. So today, just as a little bit to go through, so we're going to go a little bit about the process that we've gone through. Then we're going to look at the challenges of our existing formula, the foundation program, and then look at some potential pathways for how we might modernize that formula. And finally, just give you an overview of the draft recommendations that the commission is considering. And just to give you context, nothing has been decided in this situation. It's still very much under conversation, and so I know that y'all be part of those discussions as well. So just to give you an overview of the process, during the last session, all of you passed a joint resolution to create this joint commission made up of both budget committees in the House and in the Senate. They've had 5 meetings since May, where they really began to understand our current formula and dive deep into that. That was the purpose of the first meeting with Kirk Fulford. The second commission meeting was really looking at the challenges that we have, some of which we'll discuss today, as well as what a student-weighted funding formula might look like. Then for 3 and 4 meetings, they really looked at if we went to a student-weighted funding formula, what would those potential models look like? How would those be calculated? How might that impact local districts and benefit them? And finally, at the most recent meeting, they had a draft report that they considered 3 recommendations that we'll look at today. They will have their final meeting next Thursday at 9:30 in room 200, where they will adopt whatever they decide to adopt at that time. So starting out with some of the challenges, and they really kind of fall, if we think about it, into three buckets, and you'll see the bulk of that here. The first is under-resourced, that we don't have enough money in the current system to address the needs of our students, despite significant increases over the last several years. It's inefficient, and when we say that, we really mean that the current funding formula, because of its structure, really doesn't drive money to the students that need it most. It's really more of a one-size-fits-all approach, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And finally, it's inflexible. There is a lot of restriction in how local districts can spend the dollars that they are distributed by the state, and there's a real lack of local decision-making authority, that, especially when we compare ourselves to other states. So if we think about under-resourced, so in raw dollars, if we look back to 2008, it looks pretty good. We've increased funding for Alabama students per pupil by almost $1,100. So we've seen significant increases through increased budgets that have been passed by this body. But when we look at inflation over that same time period, we see that we've actually decreased by $860 per pupil. So while there has been significant increases in funding, that has not kept up with inflation, and that certainly has an impact on our districts as they try and serve the needs of students. When we think about kind of how inefficient our current formula is, I promise I only have one scatter plot today, so we'll try and keep that to a minimum. But what you're seeing on this screen, each of those dots represents an individual Alabama school district. And on the left-hand side, we're really looking at the per pupil funding per district or per student. And on the bottom, you see the percentage of that district in poverty. And so what you would hope to see is, as more students are in poverty, they would also receive more funding to address student needs. That is not what we see in this picture. What we see is a flat section of circles, which means that there is no correlation between the way that we fund students and student need. And so that's a challenge that we have, and to think about it a different way, this big bar of blue or green or teal, whatever it may be, is the $5.3 billion in our current foundation program today that we're sending out to local school districts. And that tiny little sliver of gray, of red at the top represents 1% of the funding that is actually going to address student needs in our current funding formula. So from an efficiency standpoint, from targeting student needs, we can see that we have some significant challenges. And I mentioned this as well. In the current funding formula, these are kind of the two buckets of inflexibility that we see. One is that it's very, very structured in how we fund local school districts today. Many of you know this. We have a unit-based system where we fund teacher units, classroom instructional materials and supplies, et cetera. Those are very structured. Districts are required to spend them the way they are and have very little flexibility to move things around based on the needs of their students. And that really constrains local leadership. They don't have the ability to say, here are the challenges I'm facing here in my district and the students that I need to serve, and they lack that local leadership. And so what we want to drive, and what we see in many other states, is pushing that decision-making authority to the local level so that the locals that are serving the needs of those students can really make those choices. And finally, the commission has looked at a lot of research, but this is just kind of the high point here that I just want to flag for you. First of all, research shows us that certain student populations do simply cost more to educate. And if we want them to meet the academic goals that we as a state have set out for them and to become productive members of the workforce and society, we have to fund them. We especially see this with English language learners, students with disabilities, students in poverty. We need to fund these children at a higher rate so that they can be successful. And what we see in the research is that just by funding students $1,000 more per pupil, that is the equivalent of providing 72 additional days of learning. So a significant impact by just increasing the funding to provide more resources to address student need. So what we're seeing is we have challenges, and what we're seeing is, and the research tells us that in order to resolve some of those challenges, we need to address the way that we fund students. Finally, I just want to spend time in the next session talking about what are the potential pathways that the commissioners are currently looking at. And these are pretty straightforward, and I'm going to go each one of these in depth. And the first is we do nothing. We continue to fund our current foundation program the way it is and not address the student need challenges that we have. Option two is that we adopt a brand new student-weighted funding formula like Tennessee did, like Mississippi did. Option three is that we adopt a hybrid approach. We take our current foundation program and we add funding for weights for student needs on top of that existing program. So those are kind of the three options that they are currently considering. So option one, the stick with what we have. So this is kind of a visual representation of our current foundation program. So as I said, it's kind of that one size fits all approach. You have this many kids, you get this many teachers, this many textbooks, this many school buses, to put it simply. And you have that lack of flexibility that we talked about. So this is how that works currently. Of course, embedded in that are teacher salaries, benefits, classroom instructional support, other current expense, student growth. All these elements are still kind of baked into that current formula. So that's what we have today in that resource-based funding formula. Now, option two, and this is what would look like to go to a brand new student-weighted funding formula. And really the reasoning behind this is, one, our funding formula is over 30 years old. And if you can think back 30 years of how things have changed both in life, in the world, and especially in schools, a lot has significantly adjusted. And so what we've seen the rest of the country move toward is more of this student-based funding model. Our foundation program 30 years ago was a response. It was an improvement. It was a response to needs at the time. But we know more now, we have more data now, and we have examples that we can move toward to make a difference for students. We're one of only 6 states that are still funding our schools in a resource-based manner. And with increased funding, you're also empowered with greater flexibility. So states that adopt this type of formula have essentially a lot more flexibility over how they allocate resources at the local level. It's more of, here's the amount of money you earn based on, the students you have, and I'll show you a little bit more of that, but you also get the flexibility that comes along with that as you're trying to move in that direction. And this would kind of replace the one-size-fits-all approach. Now, there is a challenge with this. I mean, this takes a shift. It takes a lot of work initially to get this up and running. Now, once it's running, it is a lot more simple than what we have now, but there's a lot of study that needs to be done, a lot of educating of local stakeholders, of superintendents, of school budget officers, certainly state officials as well, on how to best use this going forward. And so that's certainly a challenge that we need to consider as we're thinking about it. So as we continue kind of the student-weighted funding formula discussion, so this is still option two, I just want to walk you through just a little bit more of how that might be built. So there are some questions that we have to answer. First and foremost is the base amount that is basically the base amount of funding for your typical student. And so, on average in Alabama, we fund kids at about $7,500 per kid per year. At the moment, that could be a potential base where you're sending that amount and you have a kid, you get that amount of money. But on top of that, you layer additional weights based on the needs of the students. So if you have students in poverty, students with disabilities, English language learners, rural students, charter school students, those would get additional weights because they have additional cost associated with those students. And this is kind of another depiction of that. So here you have the base amount at the bottom, and then for that particular district, here's the additional pots of money you might receive because you serve those individual students. And so to give you an idea of what this looks like, I know this is small, but you have it in your packets to review later. This is just a comparison of what Tennessee and Mississippi did. So for example, in Tennessee, they did a base amount of $7,000 per kid. They did a 25% weight for low-income students. And so they add that on top of that $7,000. They did a kind of sliding scale of weights, a tiered weight for English learners ranging from 20% to 70%, meaning if you're newer to the country and have significant challenges, then you would get more funding initially to help teach those students how to speak English. Some states, like Mississippi, have a gifted weight at 5%. Other states have a CTE weight. Mississippi did that as well. Both Mississippi and Tennessee chose a concentrated poverty weight. So taking that poverty weight that you might have and layering on additional funding for districts that have greater than 50% of poverty, because we know that when poverty is concentrated, that you have additional needs that you need to address. And finally, a rural or sparsity weight, where you're looking at districts that have significant challenges and economies of scale in our rural districts. So moving on to option three, and this is the hybrid approach that the Commission really delved into during their last meeting. So if we think about a hybrid, and just as a reminder, this would be keeping our foundation program as it is today in place in terms of how we allocate resources, but it would be layering on additional funding for student needs on top of that program. That obviously reduces the initial complexity. The foundation program is already in place. People understand, at least, I should say, certain stakeholders understand how that works. So there's at least some consistency there to make people comfortable as you transition potentially to a new formula. You would add those weights on top. Now, this would be meaningful. If you invest significant resources in those student weights, those student needs, this could have a real impact, and it would be a great first step in moving to a new formula. The challenge is, as you see, this isn't going all in. This is not moving, taking the big swing and going to a student-weighted funding formula. And there's also, again, we've talked about the amount of inflexibility in our current foundation program. And so there are discussions ongoing about ways that we could add flexibility to that current program as well. So that's the ongoing challenge of what we're seeing. And again, just visually, again, you're keeping that green stack of foundation program and just adding the weight portion is what that would look like in a hybrid model. And finally, I've kind of talked through this already, but just for clarity, the existing foundation program, we would leave that in place, meaning you would still have increases over time for PHIP, for salaries, for TRS, all the standard increases that you make on an annual basis as the budget committee makes on an annual basis, that would remain the same. And that existing foundation program would kind of be the base for the student weights. And on the student weights, the weights that are in discussion are English learners, special education, charter schools, and gifted. And that would be calculated on an annual basis of just the average student funding. So you take that current average of $7,500 and you calculate a weight for poverty, a weight for English learners, a weight for gifted, et cetera. The other piece that's been very important to the committee is if we're going to add additional funding, and especially at the levels that we're talking about, that there needs to be more accountability in the system as well, so that we know that as we're growing and spending additional funding as a state, that we're seeing greater returns and that students are seeing the benefit, and certainly the long-term academic benefit of moving forward. Finally, this is just an example in terms of, before we kind of move on to the next section, a look just over the next few years of what this might look like. So the blue bar is just a basic assumption about growth that you might see in the foundation program, and at the top would be additional funding that you might consider in FY26 at 60 million, potentially FY27 at 29 or 90 million, and then in the next year at 100 million, and so forth. Now, this can be adjusted obviously by the budget committee and the full legislature, depending on how the body wants to go. We did see in the governor's budget today, she put a number of $100 million in the EOR fund, the Educational Opportunities Reserve Fund that you created in 2023 for $100 million to go toward the discussion around these weights. And so again, that would put additional money than this slide contemplates here. And so that will be up to the committee to consider as they consider how much and at what level. Another question has been, how do we afford this? And I'm not Kirk Fulford, as most of you heard from him this morning. I'll say these are his slides, and so I'll just pass this along. But there are 2 points that I just want to point to here. This looks at looking at the spending caps that we have in place over the next 5 to 6 years and moving forward. And so you see, starting in FY25 and moving on to FY 2030 at the bottom, if you go to the column on the far right hand, if we spend to the spending cap, these are the additional funds that you have at your disposal to spend for K-12 if things continue the way they are over the next 5 to 6 years. And so you can see that looks at about $400 million new dollars. Now, of course, that increase would also have to include other expenses that you want to fund as well, from teacher salaries and others. But that additional money could either come from here or from the Educational Opportunities Reserve Fund, which right now has $1.1 billion in that account. So there is room over time to spend some of that reserve fund money and some of the growth over time to make sure that this is affordable and sustainable as you grow into the new funding formula. The last thing I'll mention from Kirk's standpoint, these are some of the current items that you fund that are related to student need in the budget. So at-risk funding, English learner funding, gifted funding, each of these, all of this totals about $78 million. That's also money that could be reallocated to fund aspects of these new student weights in either a student weighted or a hybrid model. So this is the last bit that I want to leave with you. The full recommendations in draft form are in your packet, but these just at the high level as a reminder is what the commission will be considering next Thursday. So option 1, of course, as we said, is kind of do nothing and stick with our current funding formula. Option 2 is establishing a new student-weighted funding formula. And option 3 is, of course, moving to a hybrid model. And if it's option 2 or 3, the commission is also considering weights for student needs need to be included in both of those. We would want a phase in is what they're discussing, and we hope about 5 years or less as we start to think about what that would look like over time. And of course, the continued discussion about accountability and transparency that we would want to see from a system like this going forward. That's all I have, Madam Chair. Happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions, Representative Baker?
One observation and then one question. The observation would be, which you've made references. Thank you. A very good overview of this. But that is that the current system that we're on is very inflexible. And we hear that, I mean, quite often and such. And so whereas options 2 and 3, there is greater flexibility that's provided, even to the extent that although, as I seem to understand on this, with whatever weighting would be attached on the various categories, that this doesn't mean now, okay, once that weighting funding is applied to that school system, they say if it's for English language learners, it doesn't mean all that goes for English language learners, that it has to be like that. And for other areas, whatever it might be, special ed. I think it allows the flexibility for the local school system based on their current needs and based on the allotted amounts, based on the multipliers, that they would have that opportunity, discretionary, to spend according to their desires based on their system. Is that your understanding?
That's right. I think this is, again, this is a decision that y'all will have to make.
Right.
And I think there are the two options, and there's some middle ground here as well. Right. In a student-weighted funding formula, you use these student numbers and student weights to calculate the funding, and then the flexibility is given to the locals to determine how that is spent. In others, it is more on a formula basis where
Right.
you would have the amount that is allocated for special needs have to be spent on special needs. Same for students in poverty have to be spent on that.
Right.
So conversations are still going on
Right.
in terms of how that would, but yes, I think in general, and especially if you think about the ones for students in poverty, what you could spend that on is certainly more flexible than what you can currently spend foundation dollars on. So based on the needs of local, local opportunities you might have to partner with local organizations or to spend money on summer and after school, whatever it may be to address the needs of those students.
And then I guess the primary question that I had, thank you for that commentary there, but that would be, it seems like the sentiment of a lot of the Joint Commission that's working on this modernizing our education formula funding seems to be maybe embracing a little bit more of the possibility of hybrid. Now, I don't want to be too forward in speaking on behalf of the entire group, but that seems to be a little bit of some of the sentiment that I'm feeling and hearing. And so if that were the case, I just wonder somewhat aloud and somewhat asking a question here, if there would be a possibility if we see, okay, because this transition, moving from one to another and trying to come up with a base, as I seem to hear from some of those that are working on trying to establish a base, has been very, very difficult and all and such. So with that, if we were able to transition maybe or have the hybrid, that would be the third option. Then if we choose that, I wonder if there would be the possibility if down the road, would it be 5 years, 7 years later, if there would be an opportunity as we sort of get our feet under us a little bit as to maybe transition to a full. So I've never heard that even mentioned as part of the conversation. So I was just wondering, I'm throwing that out.
I mean, I think that makes logical sense. I mean, it's certainly, understandably, folks have concerns about moving from a foundation program we've had for 30 years. And
Right.
look, sometimes the devil you know is better than the devil you don't.
Right.
And so I think there's an understandable concern about that. And yes, I think in trying to identify what's included in the base and shifting your mindset from kind of funding resources to funding students is a big shift for some people to make.
Right.
And so I do think the ability to kind of maintain the foundation program with funding for student needs as an initial step so that we can invest in those students now because they need it today, while we're also making sure on the long haul that we can continue to modernize to make sure that we're keeping up with our peers and keeping up with the needs of students.
Thank you so much. So there could potentially be a full shift in time over time then. Thank you so much.
very workable.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Smith.
Tagging on the base question there, I heard, and I don't know if it's your organization that did this or not, but appropriated according to inflation, we would be at about $10,000 per student. Was that your organization that came up with
I
that?
believe that was the Augenblick study that was done in 2015.
Right, and so we've really lagged behind, and inflation has eaten up what we've tried to do. So I think that if we start now, we're already behind. So, I think the hybrid method will work. I wish we could go ahead and snatch the Band-Aid off and let's do it right. Even though we might ought to take smaller steps, I would work with that. The other thing that I saw in there too, a lot of times when you gave us other charts in here, you talked about ESL, you talked about poverty, you talked about special ed, but in those examples, and maybe it was just that, you didn't include rural.
Mhm.
You didn't include poverty, or you included poverty, but not Title I and some of those type of things. Is that in the possible formula?
So first of all, any weights are still up in the air. The commission hasn't decided which weights to go with. I will say in terms of students in poverty, I think there is very much a consensus around the need for it to address the needs of students in poverty, English language learners, special education. I think the question of rural becomes, what if it's with a full student weighted funding formula, it's critical to have a rural weight. If it's with a hybrid, there is some analysis I think that needs to be done to make sure that we're not having unintended consequences with that weight, because you'd have a lot of additional funding with poverty, with special education, with other funding as well.
And that special ed piece, even poverty, ESL, those three are easy to calculate.
That's right.
So when you start looking at rural, we have people who don't realize why it costs more to educate a person in a rural setting. And it has nothing to do with transportation. And so I think there's got to be a close look at that, and what do we use to measure students per mile? What do we do? And I know in some of my area, I have one county that's got 4 school communities. I have another county, and it has 6 school communities. It's considered less in rural than the one before. So, I think there's got to be a real close look at that when we start appropriating money, and how that will be spent, how it will be accounted for. The other thing that has not been mentioned today, but I hope everybody assumes this and understands this, this is for academics. This is for opportunities for these children who are in poverty, who are in rural areas, who need gifted services, those kind of things. So, this would be a real transition for Alabama, and I think it's one that needs. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. I will say this, I think that's why the accountability piece is so important. We're not about funding football fields. So, Representative Drummond.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to make another note that any of those options, it does not affect the local funding in any of those areas, correct?
Absolutely.
My other question, I'm on the commission, and we have not decided what those weights are.
Right.
Because I looked at the Tennessee model, and I saw that I think it was poverty was at 5%.
25.
I mean, not 25, but I think, what was it? I can't remember what it was, but it was at 5%. But I just wanted to make note because gifted, they didn't have gifted. And I just wanted to make sure everybody knew that we have not decided what those
right.
weights, and those weights can be changed over time, as I understand, correct?
Yes, ma'am. And I think, still the commission's still looking at how they want to tackle that, and where and some of that obviously depends on the amount of money that's available. And we got a little bit of, I think, a preview of from the governor today about, from their perspective, what should be allocated for this. The budget chairs have their perspective along with the commission. And so I think that's still a decision that y'all have to make based on the amount that's available.
Yeah, and as I was saying in the committee meeting, I'm very interested to see what the accountability and transparency piece is going to be. Because right now, as Van said, we have some systems that are haves and some that are have-nots. And so when you build that transparency piece, guys, I just don't, how are we going to make sure that it is fair and equitable to all? So I am, and I know you can't talk about that. I keep asking about that, but we'll get there. And I'm hoping next week I'll find out what that transparency piece is, because I represent a rural system and a urban system, and we've worked really hard on local funding for our educational system.
Absolutely.
So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yes,
Thank
ma'am.
you.
Representative Gidley.
Well, they've done a great job covering a lot of this. A couple of things, and of course, I don't sit on any of this commission, so some of this is new to me. We've been in some discussions, some places with this, and I knew this was coming. It was being looked at. But in our current model, let me make sure that I'm correct here. You forgive my naivety here, but in our current model, really there's not a lot of flexibility. It's just almost, I think Representative Garrett said one time, like counting heads. It's just you got X number of students, you get X number of dollars. And we know that is, that's not necessarily the way the demographics is across our state, because we have some areas that have a greater need in so many areas, poverty areas, other things like that. So some flexibility would be absolutely important, I think. I kind of agree. Sometimes you want to just kind of bite the bullet, but sometimes that's hard to do. So the third option of moving into this a little slower, because it is going to be difficult, because you're going to have some districts that maybe going to have their funding altered a little bit based on what their weight is, and that's going to be a little bit difficult. But I think there definitely needs to be flexibility. Now let me ask this question. If we do this, there is flexibility. What if those districts that are getting a certain amount here now, if their situation changes, is that weight going to adjust based on their, let's say their poverty level goes up or their need is not as great? That flexibility is going to be able to adjust with that. Is that what I understand?
Absolutely. And one of the reasons to include these weights in the formula itself and not as a grant program is so that that does happen. So that as you bring in additional kids in poverty or you have an influx of English language learners, that funding follows in to follow the child and have that money available for the local district to serve those needs. Same as if the child moves away, and just like we have in our current foundation program today, if you move from one district to the other, then the district you leave is funded one student less than they are, and so that part really doesn't change. But now you have weights that are also following to make sure that the resources are there to serve.
So does each school district determine those, or would they be a factor of how that will be determined as those shifts come?
So if you're looking at poverty, you would look at the direct certification rate. If you were looking at special ed, obviously those are identified, and there are a lot of different areas. And what's really been talked about, I didn't mention this before, with special ed, is actually looking at tiered funding, where you would spend more on kids that have greater special needs versus and have a lot more resources that are needed and less. So you kind of tier that funding. So again, having those kids move in and out of your district, then you would get additional funding if you had a higher needs student. So
Thank
it would
you.
follow it in. Yeah.
Representative Gray. Representative Morris.
Ask about, I see you have charter schools, so is it public charter or just,
Public charter schools, like all charters, yes, ma'am.
thank you.
Representative Paramore.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. The page that has the Tennessee and Mississippi percentages and things, I was just curious on data. I know you said something earlier that for every extra $1,000 that's spent on a student, it adds
Yep, 72 additional days of learning.
72 additional days. Do we have any data about these percentages that they've used, how much it's increased their base? I mean, is it increased their base another $1,000 per student, or is it?
So if you look at this just from a percentage standpoint, obviously if you take a 10% of 7,500, that's another $750 a kid as just a back of the napkin. The data is there and from the studies on school finance reform, just looking at this in the aggregate. So they're not looking at the study on we spend $1,000 more on each of these groups, but what they do know is that there is a higher impact on those groups. We don't have the data broken up individually,
That's fine.
but it tends to follow.
Yeah, and do we have a goal of what we want to get to with each student that fits into these categories, like a number goal, or are we just trying to?
I can't speak for the commission, but I would say from an A+ standpoint, we certainly want to get on aggregate as a state to over $1,000 a kid to try and have that impact. And what I'll say, as I've heard repeatedly from the chairman, is they want this to be impactful. So in all of the conversations they've had, it's not, because what we've been doing is trying to address and put Band-Aids on our current funding formula, establishing this grant program and that one, and we're putting Band-Aids on it and not fixing it. And so this would be the ability to not only have a significant investment of funds that are dedicated to student needs, but also to have that adjust and grow over time as our overall average funding grows as well.
Right. And then on the page that had the additional K-12 funding, your last column that you pointed out to the far right, additional K-12 dollars, is that just dollars on the increases that are going to K through 12, or is that everything and we're labeling it?
Just K-12.
Okay. I just want to make sure our other entities in education are not getting, not that they need to be left out, or I'm not arguing that point today, but just to make sure they're, all the funding's not going to one spot, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Just K-12.
Representative Farmer, I would never want to cut any section of education, but the middle column is where it's everybody included.
And I do want to remind us, too, that we talked about Tennessee did this in 23 and that Mississippi did it 24, and they really didn't have some of the accountability pieces in place. And so verifying some of this, it's just so early in the picture just to think about. Representative Smith.
All right, thank you. I mentioned a while ago because of inflation, we're behind. And maybe we can't move to that full-fledged, completely new. Thank you. New funding method, but I don't see why we can't catch up a little bit, leave it at the current funding model, but catch up some there. Off the top of my head, let's move to $8,000, which is not a big move. But then fund the weighted amounts, which will provide more, especially when you've got student counts at 20 and 25 in elementary, and then all of a sudden you've got special needs teachers who only have 5 children with them. So that kind of addresses the hiring, but those are needful hirings because you have fewer students per teacher. And then the last thing that I think maybe everybody wants to know is every formula, every graph I've seen, there is no school that's total amount goes down. So we're at least where we are, okay? It doesn't touch local funding, and if we could get a little more on the base and then begin our weighted funding, I think that it would be a great opportunity for the state.
No, you're absolutely right. And the one thing I'll add, and thank you for mentioning it, is the chairman have committed that moving to a new funding, that everyone would see additional growth. And so I think that's an important one to keep in mind. No new taxes. This is coming out of growth and reserve funds as we transition to that. No moving around of any local funding. And I will say, to your point, if you continue if we went with a hybrid model per se, if you continue to increase the amount of funding we have going into the foundation program, and you're adding those weights on top, all that weighted funding is additional money. And so you're driving more money in from the ETF into those local districts, and it's getting closer to students.
Representative Ross.
I'm curious as to, thank you. I'm curious as to today, how our current federal funding is done. How will that impact the weights? Will that be considered, and how will it be considered?
No, ma'am. Most states that have done this have not considered federal funding as a part of this. Obviously, that comes in. There are a lot of restrictions, as you know very well, on that funding and how it goes in. There are also tend to be very programmatic based and really not have the flexibility that you want to see in a student-weighted funding formula. So while some districts have additional federal money, they're also, we know today, as a state, we are not funding those student groups as well as they need to be.
Oh, so I understand that, but would that still, like if a Title I school is receiving, because of their poverty, an extra $1 million, is that going to be considered in the weighting, the way you weight it? No. So it will be in addition to the state weight?
In addition.
Okay, thank you.
And if we look at total, just from an average standpoint, if we look at total state, local, and federal money right now, Alabama is about 39th in the country in terms of total funding across the board, and we're about $4,000 under the state average. So even when we pull, or under the national average, so when we pull in federal money, we're still behind.
Representative Baker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Drummond, you've always been very engaged on this in regards to the accountability piece. So just a follow-up on that from my understanding, and of course with us all serving on, or many of us here in this group been serving on the commission. But one of the models for us to look at would be Maryland, I believe, in which where their model then provides, I mean, not only just somewhat the Constitution, the makeup of that group that provides accountability, but the best I remember, and as well, doesn't mean that we'll necessarily mirror that if we do move forward. Right now, we still haven't decided anything, so we don't know for certain what's going to go in place. But if we should move forward with this, it would be something I think that would be over a course of time and not an immediate year by year. I think it's somewhat have to be looked at over a period of time to really make a more thorough evaluation and make determinations in regards to the accountability aspect of it. But that's my understanding. Thank you.
Any other questions? I want to thank A Plus for coming up with a program for Education Policy Committee. I want to thank Mark for sharing it with us so thoroughly, and all of you, as always, for being so engaged in the process. We'll continue to keep you informed. We will have our first meeting with legislation next week, and if there is nothing else, we are adjourned.
Good, how about you? Rolling? Yeah, all right. I hope we can do a little more than just stay where we are and add weighted, but even if we just add weighted, it's gonna help. Yeah, very good.
You know the real.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm trying to see y'all probably didn't behave when I